Hey there folks. So in this video what we're going to do is we're going to look at how to take the texture files that we have got and start making sprites out of them. Sprites that we can then place into our world and start using on stuff. So when I say using them on things, what you should be able to see is if I just fly in here down to like the floor level, I've got all these textures that I have been bringing in, and I've put in a bunch of extra ones just so I've got some things for demos. If I drag this and bring it into the world, you can see I can't just drag a texture and put it into the world. So I'm going to need a sprite in order to place things like, you know, trees and decorations, interactive elements. All of those things are going to need to be a sprite actor, a sprite element. So how do I do that? Well, I brought in a whole bunch of different ones in here, and the one we looked at previously was this just simple warrior. And if I was to just go in here, you could see that I can right click, go paper 2D, and I can create a sprite. Now I'm just going to show you that we can do that, but I'm going to show you why we don't do it that way. Because when we do a sprite, it's going to ask me what name I want to give it. I'm going to delete this in a moment, so it doesn't matter. And I open this up and you'll see that this sprite basically uses a texture. Which texture? Well, it doesn't know which texture to use. So I'll have to go in here, I'll have to choose a texture. So let's say we use warrior attack. And now all 4 of these bits are being used in this sprite. So I'd have to go in here and say, well, actually, I only want to use this region of it. So I'd have to go in and start messing around with the source region to get it to use only that bit. Maybe messing around with the source UV for where this is actually registering from, the source dimensions for the different size. It's a little bit of a pain. And that might be fine if you want to make one specific thing. You want to just go to a sprite that you've drawn for a tree, a chest, a pillar, or something like that that's decorative in your world. Well, that would be okay. But there's easier ways of doing it, and the easier way of doing it is actually something we've already seen, which is when you right click and go to sprite actions, you can create a sprite. So in this instance, I would create a sprite, and you can see that creates a sprite, this light blue color here, creates a sprite from those. Again, that would be great if we only had one thing on there, but I have 4 individual, essentially sprites that I want to get. So what I need to do here is, instead of creating one sprite from this, I need to look at this texture sheet and say, how can I extract each of these out as an individual sprite? Now to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to right click it, sprite actions, and extract sprites. And this is going to give us this option here. Now this is where we can find problems. The first problem is that it's going to go on our sprite extract method. So let me try and just expand this out a little bit so you can see the wording and labeling on these. Sprite extract mode, you can see here it sets to auto. And what auto does is it looks for where there might be a change in the opacity, so a transparent kind of element where there is no pixel information, and goes, that is probably a new sprite. I'll extract that out. And you can see that works fine with things like this. It goes, okay, well, up until here, we have pixel information, up until here we have, up until here we have, and this is basically a bounding box that is the right size to fit this element in. And you can see, why is it a little bit like that? Well, it's just because there's a little bit of a shadow underneath this character. Fine on both of these. And then this one is obviously bigger. So there's going to be some issues that we might have here if we use it in this method, that each of our individual sprites might end up being a completely different size. Yeah, that's going to mean that we're going to possibly want to have the pivot point in exactly the same place. So even if this one was using the middle over here, it's not moving our character up, down, left and right. And when we get things that are like this, you can see that here we have a gap in this kind of animation smear where it does this attack. You can see there's a gap here. And where it finds that gap, it goes, well, if there's a gap, these must be separate elements. So I'm going to try and register these things here as a separate sprite. Now, not too bad on something like that, we can probably fix it. But on some elements, so I'm just going to show you on this one, some elements we really go over the top in terms of all the little details. And I'll show you how it can be really bad at finding these things. Because look at this widow here where this spider explodes, and every single one of these things is being registered. Essentially each individual pixel on these explosions is being registered as its own individual sprite. So you can see that obviously in this instance, it's just not going to work to use auto. And for the most part, you're just not going to use auto. So what are we going to do instead of auto? Let's go back to our attack and let's go back to our sprite actions and extract sprite. Well, instead of auto, we are going to choose to use a grid. And what the grid does is it basically says, okay, well, I'm going to make, first of all, a grid and it's going to have a width and a height for the cell, so each of the individual squares of the grid, of 768 by 192. Now that's not great because that means that all of these things exist in one cell. But what I could do is I could say, well, the cell width, the width is the horizontal. I've got 4 individual elements in here. So what I could do is I could take that 768 and I can either use a calculator, divide it by 4 and type that in, but you can actually use the math inside of these boxes. So if I use the / here and say 768 divided by 4, press enter, you can see that that does the math for me and says it's 192. Well, it just so happens that's great because this artist has created all of these at 192 by 192. Now, there are other things that we can do where we can start actually just saying the number of cells and the margins around the outside of it, the spacing in between. So maybe your artist has got borders and lines that go in between each one of them. Maybe you want to start messing around with the individual spacing on these, but just note that if you do that, you might need to play around with some of the other assets like the cell width here, because if I add gaps in between these, you can see it actually offsets each one of them. So it says, okay, well, there's a gap of 8 here, and then we do this one. So this is great if your artist has left in those borders. Maybe your tile sheet exists in a grid and you want to just get rid of the lines and you don't want the lines to be in there. So I'm going to put that back to 0, and now you can see that I've got cell width, cell height, 192, 192, horizontal and vertical. The other thing that we've got here is this naming template, and it says here sprite underscore and then the bit in 0. So you can see here the name of the sprite will be created, 0 will get replaced by the sprite number. So what we can do here is we can actually look at what this is going to do by default and then see if there's any value to changing it. Now it says here naming start index. This is great if you have only one animation that you're extracting out, because then obviously it starts at 0, goes 0, 1, 2, 3. If you were doing something like the spider widow, well, it's not as valuable then, because obviously we've got every single row being a new animation, and what we'd essentially have there is 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 0, and so on. So use that if it's useful for you, but for the most part, you're probably going to rename your sprites anyway. So I'm going to extract this, and now what you'll see is that it's created a sprite for each of those. Because they were all running at 192 by 192 on their extract, they're all exactly the same amount of size. And if I go into here, you'll see that we've now got this sprite asset. So I'm just going to close that one down because it's opened up on the window behind. And what have we got? Well, we're going to go through a bunch of these different sprite options here. We're going to have a look at the sprite tools up in the top corner. So view, edit source region, edit collision, edit render geometry. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a bunch of little examples. And with those examples, I can then go through and explain what each of these things do. So get this done, extract out your sprites. And then once that one's ready, we can start having a look at how we can edit and use these for our purposes. Okay, so I've taken a couple of moments just to kind of prep up a couple of those and follow that same process. So what you'll see here is I've done it in a lot more depth for the Warrior Simple, the one we've just been looking at. And what I've done is I've actually created 2 folders in here. So I've got the textures folder where all of these ones that we've imported have gone in. And then I've got a sprites folder, and you can see I've actually extracted out each of these, and I've also renamed them. So you can see I've put in a bit of a naming convention there, SPR underscore, referring to what this is. So all of them say Warrior, a little bit of a label for what the animation is, and then the number in terms of what number of the sequence it is. So you can see they start at 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for the most part. There you go. So I've got all of those extracted, and one of the things that you'll see is if I go into some of the other ones, things like Warrior Advanced, this one was nice and easy because they actually were all 192 by 192. You can see this one's got a 4-way movement essentially, because we can flip the right hand direction to be the left hand direction, but it also has downwards and upwards animations. Now this one was great because when I did the extract and extracted it on a grid, you can see there, it actually brought out everything nice and uniformly because every animation had the exact same amount of things. Whereas if I were to look at something like the ghoul, you can see the ghoul, when I've extracted this out, I've got lots of these individual sprites that actually contain no information. So one of the things I would advise if you're doing this, it's actually kind of easy to go extract sprites, go with the grid, and luckily this artist actually names their things based on the actual size you should go for. So rather than having to count how many of them are and do the math, you can just type in. So I typed in 62 by 33. And one of the things you'll do after this is just go through and just go, which ones do I not need? So if I was to open this up, one of the little things I do is I go to edit source region, and you can see here it shows you for each one of the sprites that is being created from this source texture, what area on the actual the starting texture, what source region do they use. So you can see here, if I go through this one, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, they're all completely empty. I would warn you to just be a little bit careful on some of them. So things like this, when the ghoul gets killed and dies and it fades away in a little kind of puff of pixels, well, number 50 here actually contains no sprites at all. 2 pixels, whereas 51 contains no pixel information at all. So 50 would want to keep that one, 51 onwards would want to get rid of those. So it's always worth just popping in, having a little bit of a look inside of here and just making sure that before you go, okay, well, from this distance, these all seem empty, so let's just take them and delete them. Just check that there's nothing else inside of there. The other thing as well is that when you're sorting these out, so here it was nice and easy because I could just be like, okay, well, there are individually here 6 things going across, so I could just go, okay, well, let's select those. I've got 6 selected. I know that they are the first thing, and then these ones are the next. And sometimes it's really easy to see. You can see that this is running whereas this is attacking. But sometimes when the row that is above and the row that's below are very similar in terms of the character's starting and end position and what they're doing, it might be harder to actually determine exactly what that is. So that's why sometimes I'll create these folders and I'll just move the sprites that are there that I've extracted into their individual folders, so I don't get confused and I don't accidentally put the wrong sprite into the wrong animation or name them in the wrong way. So yeah, advanced was nice and easy. Ghoul was not so much, but I do need to just fix up a couple of things. Ghoul's one of the ones that I put in just to kind of demonstrate what happens if we do start messing around with some of these options here in terms of the opacity and the translucency. So you can see here that this one, for example, this explosion effect, it has these opacity elements to it. So one of the options that you'll see is that when I've extracted this out, it's gone, what should the default material be that this uses? And if you remember from looking at the actual paper 2D default material options, we had translucent and we had masked. Now they're both defaulted at unlit, perfectly fine with that. But if I go and have a look at this translucent option, if I was to potentially go and have a look at and instead use masked unlit, so I'll select that and then go back to the ghoul and change it here, you can see that now what it's using is a clipping value on that mask to go anything above this opacity is opaque and anything below it is now going to be completely transparent. So that's great if you do want this kind of hard masked element of it's either visible or it's not. But if you don't, if you want to have that and go the opposite way and have the kind of translucency element, then you're needing to use the translucent material. Now you can see here, I can't select it from this drop down. If I wanted to, I'd have to show the engine content to be able to see that. But you can see I can use that kind of browse to this asset in the content browser. It takes me to the engine folder to find where that is. And I can select the other one and use the arrow to use that. Again, this is where potentially I would recommend that you would go in and make your own versions of these or make copies of these so you're not constantly going back to the engine files in order to mess around with this. So yeah, the ghoul, I'm showing you that one because I think the ghoul is a really good example of where it's got that transparency. You can see even on things like the side of its head there, those things can get easily missed, but it has a little bit of that glow. So I want to just make sure that that doesn't get lost as we're working through by maybe making it masked instead. Now, the next one, I've got this hero, and what you can see here is this hero has a very, very big kind of texture sheet. So one of the things that you might want to do is actually just extract out some of these bits bit by bit. Like, it might be that you look at this and go, well, if I was to extract out everything that's in there, and let's just show you how that happens. Sprite, extract, grid, and as you can see, 54 by 53, 54 by 53, you can see that I'm getting a lot of empty sprites for this one. So what it might be worth doing is just going, actually, when I'm doing it like this, maybe I don't extract out everything in this first process, because we've got to think, how much time are we wasting by having to go through this afterwards and fix each of these, removing the extra ones, checking them. So what's the kind of average on here? Well, actually the longest one here. So go 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The longest one is 8. So if I were to just go with, let's extract out 8 things, what I could do is I could just say, well, let's extract out just those 8, and then let's come back later and just do this bottom row. Maybe we just type in only that bottom row element. We can use the margins and spacing to get us to just do that one. Now, to just show you that, if I do number of cells and only do 8, you can see we can actually restrict what we extract out. So just keep that one in mind as well. Maybe you don't need to go through if your sprite sheet has a load of empty space to the right of it. And again, let's think about this. We're saying with this grid, we're going to take the whole size of this and we're going to extract out every single thing based on these grid sizes. Now, what if your artist is still working on this? What if they've built a really big sprite sheet, ready to add extra things on, ready to extend out animations, but right now they've only got the first 4 columns filled in, but they built a sprite sheet that's got 8 columns worth of space on it? Well, you could just use this number of cells, and this determines how many of them will I actually extract out. And that stops me having all of these abundance of empty elements, when really I've only got 2 animated bits in some of these animations. Now, the other reason why I've included this one is for this effect here and this effect here. So let's have a look at what's actually going on with these ones. If we go and have a look at the source region and have a look, you can see that these have actually been fixed up and improved from previous versions that I've downloaded here. But what if I had this where these were too close to the edge? What if one of them was overlapping and going on to the opposite side? Now, I have had that before, where I've had a sprite that's swung around its kind of effect. It's got the effect included, swung around, and it's gone over the edge. Now, you've got some options as a pixel artist to make a decision on that. Do you make the actual cell itself big enough to accommodate all of the visual details? Well, if you do, if they were to make this, maybe let's say 2 or 3 pixels bigger, just to accommodate an extra big swing on this weapon, well, what that would mean is that every single one of those sprites on that sprite sheet is now also 2 to 3 pixels bigger. And that's not always going to be the best thing. We don't want to make every single one of them bigger just because one frame of one animation is slightly too big. So what we might actually do here is we might end up overlapping in certain instances. Maybe we have 1 or 2 pixels that have to overlap in order to fit these things in. And we can just go to edit render geometry. And you can see here what I'm doing is I'm actually being able to edit the bits of that texture that are visible. And you can see it's defaulted down to the minimum based on what's in that. But if I was to left click, I can also hold control and select multiple. You can see I can expand this out and select multiples of them. Now, at the moment, this is on 10, which means it's going to snap 10 pixels at a time. But you can see I can move it down to 1 and I can draw in extra bits. I can also hold down shift and click, and I can add in extra points. Now, I wouldn't recommend going too in depth with all of these things, but if you do need to, for example, just cut out a little bit of another animation, maybe the other animation was cutting up here, we can do that. And that's a useful thing to do, just to go, okay, well, these things are really close on this tile sheet. Let's just remove the bits and only render out in this sprite the bits that we need to see. Now, as I said, this one is not so bad this time. But I have got some of these animation ones where the big kind of over-the-top effect will end up going from one sprite into another. That's also a possibility where maybe it's useful to have the effects, so these white kind of lines and the swishes and stuff, being on their own animation sprite sheet. So you can just say, okay, well, all I actually need, if we look at the average on all of these characters here, all we actually need is just this bit here that renders out our character. It's a very, very small sprite sheet if we start looking at it like that. And then all these animation bits could come in on their own VFX kind of effect instead. Okay, and then the last little bits that we'll just have a look at here, you can see that the widow, I obviously showed you when I extracted out and showed you the widow that it has an absolute abundance of tiny, tiny, tiny pieces if we were to go out and render this or extract this out on auto. So you can see here, lots and lots of these. I would go through and just make sure, again, if I'm going through these and going through the edit source region, that there are no pixels that are being visible on here. Okay, so Now that we've edited a bunch of these, you can see that what I've actually done is I've just taken some of these sprites that we have. You can see I've got the kind of animated different versions of all of these different sprites. They're all ready to go. So for example, let's just put in this guy, and I've just placed a couple of them into the world. So if you remember, we couldn't just drag a texture into the world, but a sprite can exist in our world, which is going to be great because we're going to use that for decorating and creating different elements of our levels and our world later. But there's a little bit of a problem here, and that comes from the way that sprites and their elements actually get sized in our world. So there is a value, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and show you it. We'll go into this spider here just to show you this. There is a value here called pixels per unit. So you can hover over that and you can see the scaling factor between pixels and Unreal units. Now we know if we're working in Unreal, one Unreal unit equals 1 centimeter, as you can see there, whereas there's Unreal units, centimeter, because one Unreal unit is 1 centimeter. Now, if we had pixels and we had this as 1, then what we're doing is we're saying that those are going to be matching up and saying like a 32 pixel sprite is 32 centimeters. It's going to be really, really small. And that's why, when I look at something like this tiny little widow that is a very, very small sprite that we've got, and compare it to this element over here, we're ending up with actually like really big kind of differences between this one where it's 192 and it's like 2 meters tall, or just over that. It's about a meter tall because this is a meter box, but this is like 30 centimeters, 40 centimeters. Now you could work with those sizes. You could, when we start putting our character together, just go, okay, well, it's this big, but you're going to have to reduce down the size of your capsules. You're going to have to reduce down all the kind of the movement values, the jumping values and things like that to match the fact that this is much smaller, because a character who's meant to be 2 meters tall, and the physics and the functionality and the movements of a 2 meter tall character are going to be much, much greater in scale and value than what you would expect for something that's this size. So one of the things that we can do is we can actually go into here and we can say, okay, well, let's change the pixels per unit of this to a different value. So I'm going to go with something like 0.25, 0.24. They're usually quite good values. And if I just save that and go, yep, that's fine, what you can see is that now this has resized it. So it's 4 times bigger than it was. And we're basically saying that now the actual pixels that are being used scale much better against those actual kind of Unreal units, the centimeters. Now this enemy is about 2 meters tall now. This is about a humanoid kind of scale, and that's probably going to be a lot better and a lot more kind of closely resembling the movement values and things that we may have been using otherwise. Now, here is the little bit of a problem. I would have to go now and change that for every single one of my sprites, which is, it's problematic. It's a bit of a problem to have to do that for everything. So what we'll do is we'll go to Edit, Project Settings, and we will search for Pixel. And you will be able to go down here into the Editor, Paper 2D Import Settings here, and we can say what are the default pixels per Unreal unit. The reason why we didn't change this in the project settings options is because I wanted to show you how it actually works. There's no point going change this, change it to 0.25 instead of 1, because you'd have no idea why we were changing it. I wanted to show you the differences of that. But now, when we go to 0.25, it means that every new sprite that we create will automatically, so for example this one, it would automatically have its pixels per unit set as 0.25. Now what you can see is that now this is going to say, would you like to reset this property back to its default value? Well, you can see actually this sprite, the default value in Engine isn't 0.25, it's 2.56. So it's not going to allow me to just go in here and just go, okay, well, let's just tick this box and do it. And I definitely don't want to have to go through here and change every single one of them manually to 0.25. Because if, like me, you've already gone through and done a whole lot of extracting, then we're in for a bit of a bad time, because that's a very repetitive task. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to select all of the sprites that we've got in here, and we're going to edit them all in one go. Now you can see that if I'm selecting like a root fold, like here with the ghoul, it's nice and easy. I've not really sorted him yet. I can take all of those by holding shift and I can edit them all in one go. But what if I'm actually trying to get things from multiple folders? What if I want to go into, this one and then this one and then this one? Well, that's going to be, again, very tedious. So what we can do is we can go here where it says search assets, and just to the left of that you've got these three little lines, and this is your filter menu. And when I'm working in 2D on a 2D project, what I like to do is I like to create a bunch of filters that help me find the things that I'm going to be working with the most in that project. So you can see here, if I go to all filters, paper 2D, I can create filters for paper flipbooks. The green one, we'll create those in a bit. We can go in here and we can create one for sprites. We can create them again if we go in here and have a look for things like our tile maps and our tile sets. And also we can do them for the paper ZD. Now, I'm not saying that you have to go and create all these, and I'm not saying that you would definitely need all these, but it's useful to have them because it means that you can come in here and really quickly search through everything. You can select that root folder and just go, cool, all right, I'm going to select the assets folder and I want to see all of the sprites. Another thing that maybe I want to have in here is textures, because I do use a lot of textures, so it would be the generic texture one. So you can say, show me all the textures. Let's go through them and just make sure that they're all using paper 2D texture settings. Let's select here and go, show me all the sprites. It doesn't matter what folders, we go through all the folders and it will show me all of the sprites that are in there. So now what I can do, you see there are 545, obviously because I haven't got rid of the empty ones yet, but I can go Control A to select all those, right click, and now rather than having to go into each one of those, because again, could you imagine having to change the pixel scaling on every single one of the 545? Well, rather than having to do that, we can go to Asset Actions. We can go to Edit Selection in Property Matrix, and this will bring up a matrix that has all of the things we've just selected and all of their properties. So you can see here there are certain pinned columns that you would use a lot, but also basically the details panel for those. So do I want to go through, let's take all of these, do I want to go through and change the default material on all of them to use the translucent instead of the masked? Do I want to go and change maybe the source texture on all of these? Yeah. Do I want to change some collision options on every single one of them? Yeah. These are really useful things for us to do. The other thing is you can see pixels per unit. Now right now pixels per unit is showing multiple values because I have just selected one of those widows. You can see this widow here which already is at 0.25. But if I override this, change it to 0.25 and press enter, this will now go through every single one of these, update them, and luckily, 545 is quite a lot, so I probably wouldn't do those all in one go. I'd do them in smaller batches and save after each batch. But you can see now it's gone through 545 sprites, updated their pixels per unit, and all I'm just going to do is just save. This is asking me what level, where do I want to save this demo level? Don't really mind that, I probably won't use it much further anyway. But we'll just save it, and then if we go into every single one of these sprites once that map has saved, which it's just doing now, there we go, updating all of those sprites, saving each one of them, and then perfect. Okay, now if I go into one of these, open them up, you can see every single one of them is updated to 0.25. We go and have a look at the map, and you can see that now the map has updated to take into account the size of each of these. So you can see these ones, which are the pixel frog ones, they are much bigger in terms of their size, and these ones, they are bigger, not as big. So there's some considerations that we might have if we were mixing things from different kind of artists and different kind of styles. But now you can see that these are much bigger in terms of matching the kind of the normal scale that we're used to. If you wanted to use these with these, then again, you might need to go through and you might need to change this. So maybe 0.25 isn't small enough. Maybe you would want this one. And again, let's just have a look at what this could do if we were to halve this again and go to 0.125. You can see that this becomes even bigger. Now, something to be aware of is the size of each of the individual pixels and how big each one of those is going to be showing up as. But you can see that we do have, quite an interesting scale, an interesting size on that one. Okay, so the last little thing that we might want to do then, just with our individual sprites, getting them ready to use in terms of all of the other elements, and that is the pivot point. So we're just going to have a look at this guy here. The reason why is you can see that his pivot point, his point that he registers himself as in central, like in space, in XYZ space, is over here. Well, why is that? If we were to have a look at where he exists on his source region, you can see he's just over to the side. Yeah, so maybe actually this isn't the best sizing for every single one of these. Yeah, maybe I actually need his pivot point to not be here in the middle, but I need it to be here between his legs. And that would be a good consideration for every single one of these to go through and say, well, where should the pivot be? It might be the case with the spider. You can see that the spider is tracking his position, because if we think about where he exists, maybe because it's such a big sprite sheet to accommodate things like, you know, these explosions down here where all of the smoke goes up into the air, to accommodate all of those things, we're having to make this really big sprite, when really actually what I want is I want his pivot point to be down here. So how do we change that? Well, the first one is we go over to pivot mode. So here in my sprite window, I go over to pivot mode, and you can see that that's visible in view or in edit source. And we're going to change this here from center center, and we can change it to exist in all different places. So it could be on the top, on the left, on the right, on the bottom, in the middle, and combinations of those. Center center is the default, but if I was to take this guy and maybe put it at bottom center, you can see that now his pivot point is down at the bottom. That's going to be this point here, and luckily, you know, you can see that obviously it gives us this little marker in between. Luckily, that's showing us exactly where that pivot's going to be. Now, is that okay? That might be okay for the widow, for the spider. You can see now I've got to actually move him back down, press end, snap him back down to the floor. That might be okay for the spider. One of the things that you've got to think about is that these are going to rotate in the world, and they're going to rotate usually their right hand direction to be their left hand direction. So here, if I was to rotate him round this way, does this match up in terms of where I would like to rotate him round? Yeah, maybe I do want to have that. Maybe I need to move it over here so it's in the center of the body. That's a decision that you'll have to make, and it's very much again based on these sprite sheets. One of the things that you might find here is that he is slightly over to the side because he has lots of these animations and effects where he stabs forward and we need the extra space. So this one's not so bad. This one's okay. There's a lot of space on either side for things like the explosion. But the hero, we can see straight away this hero is a problem. Yeah, bottom is not really going to work. Bottom center over here, left center, or left side, right side, none of those is going to put this exactly where I want it. And what that's going to mean is, you know, here where it's center, if I were to rotate him round that, and I want to say, okay, well, now he's going from his right hand animation to his left hand animation, and we rotate him round, you can see how the character's actually jumping from one side of that pivot point to the other. So if I was to flip him 180 degrees, he's jumping from one side of the pivot to the other. Really, I just want him to rotate round the middle of himself. Now, to do that, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to edit this rather as center. We're going to have to change this to custom, and we're going to have a look and say, okay, well, where does that pivot exist? And this is where it's best to be on view, because you can see this little marker, and you can see that actually I've got his custom pivot point right now is at 27. I usually get a little bit of a notebook here because I would like to write down what is the offset on X and what is the offset on Y in order to achieve this. So how do I get this to go down? Let's have a look. It's already at 27. I've noted the 27 down, so that's going to be an important value for me to remember. Let's go with 30. Okay, well, that's moving it the wrong way. So let's go with 20, and that's probably too far, so maybe we go with 22, 21. There we go. Nice and perfect in the middle. So I know that I've got to move every single one of them minus X on the minus 6 on the X, and that's obviously for this specific artwork here. It might be a different value for yours. Next one, I want to move this down, so 30, probably not enough, 33, and I could probably count the pixels for some of these smaller ones, so you can see that one is +5 on there. Okay, so we can reset that back to the 27 by 27 if that makes it easier for you. And then what we'll do is the exact same thing as we've just been doing. We can take this and we can bulk edit these in the property matrix. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get rid of all the extra ones just for now because they're going to get in the way. And then I'll come back and I'll show you how to do this in the property matrix. Okay, so fixing the issues that we've got then with this little hero guy where his pivots over to the side. One of the things that I've just gone through and done is I've gone through and I've taken all of the different sprites from him. I've removed all the empty ones. I've renamed them so now you can see that they're all SPR_hero. They're labeled with the animation and they're also numbered so you can see, like, for the downward animation attack it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All of them are now renamed and there's a texture and a sprites folder. Now why have I done that? Well, it just makes it a little bit easier now when I'm going through here and taking these and going into the asset actions and bulk, the edit selection in property matrix. I went to say bulk there, and that's because in a previous older version of Unreal it would be labeled as bulk edit via property matrix, but now as of around 5.4 onwards it now says edit selection in property matrix. Now the reason why I've done this is because now with all of these selected, you can see I can actually go in here and change their pivots. So I can take all of these and I can go into here and I can say pivot mode, let's change all of them to be custom. Okay, so now they're all on custom, and what I might want to do now is I might want to go through each one of these and start messing around with these values. Now one of the things that you'll notice is that some of them are on 27, 239, and that's because obviously this one here is 239 pixels down in the image, and as they move around you can see that they're obviously all changing. And you could try and take these, so I could take this, take multiple values and say, okay, well this one, on this one we want to take all of them and move them 6 over. They've all updated there. And let's just have a quick look and see what happens if we go and have a look at them all in the content browser. Well, this one here, you can see it hasn't moved it over. Yeah, it's still at 459. If I was to go and have a look at this one again, it's still over to the side. So it hasn't actually updated and moved each of these ones over. I think the idle ones are the best examples for that. So let's go and have a look at that idle down where we started. You can see it hasn't moved it over at all. So this is why it's quite useful with the bulk edit option and the labeling that we've done to be able to go through. And if I take all of these and again bulk edit or edit selection, what I could look at is say, well, actually all of the ones that are 0, if we think about what these look like in our sprite sheet, so let's just have a look at the sprite sheet for a sec. All of the ones that are 0 exist here, and 1s and 2s and 3s. Now it would be great if there was a really useful tool to be able to do this all in one go, to maybe have an option for bulk editing the pivot and moving it over for all of these, but we don't really have that. So we have to do this little bit of tedious work at the start, and I'll show you just one of them, but once I've done one, we can just go through and change it on each of them. So what I can do here is I can first of all say, okay, well, the attack down, all of these are attack down. You can see that because all of them have the exact same value here. Now, again, we could do the math inside the box, and I know that I want to make all of these move by 5. So I'm going to take that, add 5, and all of them have now moved across. If I save that and have a little bit of a look. Now, what about all the ones moving across on the opposite way? Well, let's take all of the zeros. I'm going to take this 0, this 0, this 0, and we know that all of these zeros are the ones that appear on the left-hand column. Yeah. Now, the way that this one's laid out, because there's so many on the left-hand side, it means it's actually quite easy to do this, because once we've done the first couple, half of these aren't going to be needed anymore anyway. But you can see now all of these are showing as having a slightly different value, and that might be because the idle down was the one being edited, maybe, or one of these ones is not a 0. Maybe let's just have a quick, let's just grab a couple of idles just to show you. You can see that they're all set to 27. So what about the idles? Are they all still? No, one of these idles here. Okay, they're idle right. Okay, that is why. Now, if I just remember correctly, that's because the way this sheet has been done is that all of these exist, even though I've numbered them 0, these idles all exist on their own row. So idle down, idle up, idle right. So I'm actually going to leave the idles out of this because otherwise they're going to cause me problems. So idle won't be in here, but we can go with dash, dash, and dash. Def is quite a long one. Leave the idles out, although we can do idle down because that was the first one. And then all of these different walking options. And there we go. They're all appearing as 27. So now what I can do is I can go through here. I can say let's -6 from those. And let's just save everything there. let's go and have a look at what's happened. Well, you can see that the pivot point has moved over. It hasn't moved down, not on this one, because obviously I didn't move it on this one. I moved it on the attack down. So let's just go and find a attack down. And what we should see is the attack down one. Now that pivot point is right in the middle. And can you see how when I rotate him round, it's rotating him round from between his feet. It's not offsetting him from one side to the other. So the thing that you're going to want to do here, and this is a tedious task, there is no easier way that I know of, and I would love to build an editor utility tool that I could share to you guys to do that, but sadly the pivot mode and the custom pivot points aren't things that I seem to be able to access to create a pivot tool for this. If that becomes available, if I can get somebody to help me with that, then yeah, we'll create a useful tool for the community where it allows you to bulk edit pivots. But for now, the tedious bit that you have to do is just go through these and go, okay, all of these attack rights here, they're all on this number. Let's just add 5 to each of those. These ones, let's take all those and let's add 5 to those. And we just fix these pivots. As I said, it's going to take a while. It's a little bit of a tedious job, but once you've done it, and you can see I'm just doing it very quickly while we're talking. Once you've done it, all of your different animations should have a more consistent pivot point. That means they can all be placed in a much more intelligent way, rotating around the middle. And the key thing that's going to show this off, and this one, you know, it might feel like this one's going to be fine. It might work perfectly when it flips over, but the key thing that's going to show this off is when you get your character moving left and right, look at the point that they're rotating around. If they look like they're slightly being offset to the side or up above, or maybe, you know, for example, this hero, if he was to use his dash ability and the moment he used his dash or his attack, he was offset up or down, that's where you know you need to just come in and do a little bit of work on the pivot and just get that fixed. So that's the last little thing that we need to edit here. Once you've done that, it means that all these sprites are going to be ready. So just reminding us and going through what we need to do. We need to extract out all the sprites, make sure that they're all using the correct areas of the sprite sheet, that we've not got any empty bits. Go through the naming conventions, get them all named based on what they are, get the numbers, so you can see here with the animations, they go up 0 all the way up to 7 on this one. Make sure they're using the correct material. This one, for example, everything is masked, whereas the ghoul needed to use the translucent. Make sure they're using the correct pixels per unit, and if necessary, set that up in the project so that it applies to everyone you're doing. If you can do it from the get-go and get it set up, do a couple of tests, set up your pixels per unit. Every sprite sheet, textures and everything you bring in will all use that by default. And if necessary, fix any overlapping issues, any render geometry options, and go through and change up those pivots. And once that's done, we're going to have a whole bunch of really useful sprites that we shouldn't need to come back and edit again, but we can now use these to start making animated elements, putting these into the world and creating levels out of them, and using them in functional elements like our blueprint characters. Thanks for watching, folks. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider subscribing to access more of my Unreal Engine content.